President Mandela is being rightly memorialized for his service to his country and for advancing the cause of freedom around the world. The difficult period, the long period, the maddening political struggle leading up to his release is a story that is not as widely told. Part of it that I want to focus on this morning is the political debate that was taking place here in the U.S. What lessons should we be taking away from that? What lessons should we be taking away from that? Because the reception that Mandela received from Washington wasn't always like the one that greeted him on his first trip to the Capitol in June of 1990.
Members of the Congress, it is my great privilege, and I deem it a high honor and personal pleasure, to present to you Mr. Nelson Mandela, Deputy President of the African National Congress.
And it wasn't just Congress on that trip back in 1990. Crowds of Americans, black Americans, white Americans, brown Americans, all sorts of Americans turned out in droves for the chance to be in the presence of, to be in the remote vicinity of, a man of rare courage, character, and compassion. You've probably heard of a Bronx cheer. We'll check out what happened when Nelson Mandela showed up at Yankee Stadium back then.
You now know who I am. I am a Yankee.
And I don't even think a Red Sox fan would have minded that, and I speak as a Red Sox fan. What you would never know, though, looking at that scene, that was for Nelson Mandela to be there at Yankee Stadium that day, for him to stand on Capitol Hill and be hailed by Democrats and Republicans in Congress for that trip to the United States to happen back in 1990. Nelson Mandela had to receive a special waiver from the U.S. Department of State. Otherwise, he never would have been allowed in the country. It's because he was a member of the African National Congress, the ANC, the name of the liberation movement that fought apartheid in South Africa for decades. A movement that the white apartheid rulers of South Africa threw Mandela in prison for being a part of, giving him a life sentence before releasing him after 27 years in captivity. And even then, even in the summer of 1990, those first months after Mandela had finally been let out of jail, even as South Africa was finally starting to take those first fragile steps away from apartheid and toward real, genuine, multiracial democracy, even then, as Nelson Mandela was being hailed as a hero all across the globe, the United States government officially considered him a member of a terrorist organization. They forced him to endure the indignity of receiving a waiver, of being told, in effect, sure, come on in, we'll give you some awards, we'll call you a hero, but you're the exception. The rest of that group you're a part of, the rest of the ANC, we still kind of think they're terrorists. In fact, it wasn't until 2008 that Congress finally passed, and President Bush, President George W. Bush, not his father, wasn't until 5 years ago that the U.S. government finally got around to signing legislation that formally exempted Mandela from needing a waiver. That designation of the ANC, of Nelson Mandela's ANC, the ANC that governs South Africa today and that has now done so for 2 decades. The designation of the ANC as a terrorist group by the United States is a reminder that sometimes our government, our political leaders, certain political actors, sometimes they get important things wrong. They get hugely important things very wrong. Our country, from the president to the vice president to members of Congress to pundits, everyday citizens, right now our country is mourning the loss of Mandela, remembering the life he lived, the way he changed the world. But our country and the Western world wasn't always this united in viewing Mandela as a hero. Apartheid, literally apartness in the Afrikaner language, and the government that supported apartheid was voted into office in South Africa in 1948. Over the next couple of years, that government set about passing a series of oppressive laws that imposed racial segregation, including that all black South Africans carry passbooks with them at all times. They weren't even considered citizens. 1960, when demonstrators went to the police station in the black town of Sharpeville and demanded to be arrested for not carrying their passbooks, they were protesting the need to have to carry them in the first place. In response to that small act of rebellion, South African police officers opened fire on the crowd, and 69 people were killed that day. A young liberation leader named Nelson Mandela said it was that moment that radicalized him in the fight against apartheid. He would lead the ANC in armed insurrection, and it wouldn't be long before he was arrested, he was convicted of treason, and he was sent away to prison for life. There were calls in America, in Britain, across the West for governments to speak up, to use their power, to use their influence in a country where the West had huge investments in mining interests, to use that influence to free him and to fight apartheid. But that didn't happen. Years passed. Decades passed. An international grassroots movement sprung up to boycott companies that did business in South Africa, to divest from them, to impose, to try to get governments to impose formal sanctions on that South African regime. The boycott movement took hold on college campuses here in the United States in the 1980s. A young student at Occidental College in Los Angeles asked his school's administration to stop investing in South African companies. That student's name was Barack Obama. Free Mandela became a popular rallying cry, and the message seeped into pop culture. Not everyone in America was on board with freeing Mandela and fighting the apartheid regime. A bill was introduced in Congress, the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986. It would require the complete withdrawal of U.S. business from South Africa. It would create a trade blockade. Nelson Mandela had been in prison for nearly a quarter century at that point, for 24 years, when that bill was drafted. Apartheid had been the law of the land in South Africa for 40 years. And the bill did pass the House, it did pass the Senate, and then the President of the United States wouldn't put his signature on it. Ronald Reagan vetoed the South African sanctions bill.
Night after night, week after week, television has brought us reports of violence by South African security forces, bringing injury and death to peaceful demonstrators and innocent bystanders. More recently, we read of violent attacks by blacks against blacks. Then there is the calculated terror by elements of the African National Congress, the mining of roads, the bombings of public places, designed to bring about further repression, the imposition of martial law, and eventually creating the conditions for racial war.
Reagan was the biggest name of American politicians who was on the wrong side of history, but he wasn't the only one. 79 Republicans and 4 Democrats in the House voted to sustain Reagan's veto of the sanctions bill. A Republican from Wyoming named Dick Cheney was one of them. 21 Senate Republicans voted to sustain that veto. Some of them are still there. Orrin Hatch of Utah, Thad Cochran of Mississippi. There weren't quite enough votes to uphold that Reagan veto, though, and so the sanctions against South Africa did go into effect. But for some on the right, Nelson Mandela remained a punching bag.
We didn't meet with one representative of the African National Congress, the ANC. You know, Bishop Tutu's crowd, which is orchestrated and financed by the Soviet Union. Willie Mandela, the wife of Nelson Mandela, has boasted, we have the tires and we have the gasoline and we have the matches. That's the way these little folks orchestrated by the Soviet Union act. And the New York Times and the Washington Post and CBS and ABC and NBC and all the rest of the big media and the liberal politicians, Mr. Kennedy and all the rest, they say, well, we've got to deal with these folks. We've got to meet with them. And I say, baloney.
It's understandably maddening right now, if you want to try to think back to all of that, to think back to how many leaders in this country dragged their feet and made excuses in the face of South Africa's apartheid crimes. But it's important to remember it because it wasn't that long ago. It was less than 30 years ago that a president of the United States knew all about apartheid, all about Nelson Mandela's ordeal, and still said no to sanctions. That was a real, actual political debate in this country in the very recent past. Politicians were asking not only if apartheid was a serious problem, but was it even America's problem to worry about? The story of the demise of apartheid, of the freeing of Nelson Mandela, of South Africa's march to democracy is an inspiring one. It's also a chilling one. Why did it take the United States so long to get it right? Did our leaders, did our political system, have we learned anything from that? And are we learning anything right now as we watch, as we take part in a global memorial to a humanitarian icon who as recently as 5 years ago had to have a waiver if he wanted to set foot in this country. We'll talk about that. I want to bring in Maya Wiley. She's the founder and president of the Center for Social Inclusion. Sean Jacobs, who was born and raised in apartheid South Africa. He's a writer and professor of international affairs at the New School. Pedro Nogueira, he's a professor and executive director of the Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity at New York University. And Eleanor Clift, she's a contributing editor with Newsweek and The Daily Beast. And Maya, I'll start with you because, it's sort of this universal memorial that's taking place here in the United States and everywhere around the world right now, totally deserved for Nelson Mandela. But I can't help but think that how recent it was in history that Nelson Mandela was very much a contested political figure, and we're playing some of the clips there in the intro. How do we get in such a relatively short time, from the late 1980s, even the early 1990s? We have William F. Buckley writing here in 1990 upon Mandela's release from prison that this is going to be a day of infamy, maybe. How do we get from there to here? What's happened?
Well, part of what's happened was Mandela himself was so effective at demonstrating that he was a leader of peace and of reconciliation. So the fact that people had stereotyped him into a particular type of violent, dangerous person, thanks greatly to the propaganda of the apartheid regime, by the way, he was able to transform himself by his very acts. I mean, one of the quotes that he gave, which was one of my favorite, is, "The courageous do not fear forgiveness for the sake of peace." And that's really what embodied his leadership.
So, and Sean, maybe you could take us back, because I think for people who maybe didn't live through and don't remember the political debate we just outlined there that took place in this country, in sort of the Reagan years, how did that idea of Nelson Mandela is this, maybe he deserves to be in jail, maybe apartheid's more complicated than we think it is, maybe this isn't our fight. How prevalent was that, and how did that view take hold among such a significant part of the American, political class?
I think what people forget is that American involvement in South Africa was quite deep. Economic involvement, IBM, Ford Motor Company, Coca-Cola, Kodak. So it was okay to do business in South Africa. It was fine. Lyndon Johnson said that he was at one with the South African regime, with the Rhodesian regime. It was only Nixon the same. It was perhaps only Jimmy Carter who said the United States needs a different kind of engagement with countries like South Africa, Angola, etc. Reagan then pushed back. So you can imagine Reagan was very popular. In sort of mainstream opinion, it was fine to term the ANC as terrorists. They didn't engage in armed struggle. They weren't nonviolent, and it's very difficult to sell that. The Cold War was going on, and you can use that as a bogey to say they supported, as you could see from the clip, they supported by the Soviet Union. But I think what happened here, if I was watching it from the outside, I was a teenager at the time, and so you're getting sort of these word that they're in the United States on college campuses. The African Americans, particularly, I think the people underestimate how hard it was to get people here to realize that this was a just struggle and a moral struggle. Through church groups, had begun to campaign and point out these contradictions, and particularly insisting on this economic angle, because what Reagan did was to use the Cold War as an alibi to say, we can't free South Africans because, South Africa is important to us. And by insisting that, no, this is about economic interest, it meant that people eventually could come around to that struggle.
And Pedro, you are a veteran of that movement, that college campus movement that we're talking about. Tell us a little bit about what it was you were doing, what the roots of that movement were, and how it really was became a hugely successful grassroots movement. What set it apart and made it so successful?
I think that what happened here was many Americans, particularly on the college campuses, but also in the labor unions and elsewhere, responded to the mass protests that took place in South Africa. It was the first time in 1984, after the boycott of the elections, that we'd seen mass protests in the country. And that triggered, I think, a response here. And it was particularly felt on the campuses. And it took time, but I think gradually many Americans started to change their attitudes and realize that we were supporting a government that was antithetical to everything we were supposed to believe in. And, it's really an amazing story in our own history in this country, because there's so few times when progressive people, feel as though they were part of something that actually led to a change, a concrete, tangible change, not only the release of Mandela, but change in government and the end of apartheid. And we played a role in that in a very small but significant way in this country.
Well, can you talk a little bit about what it was you were up against? I mean, we have the political system and the debate over the sanctions in 1986 that played out in this country. But more broadly, what were, especially in the early days of the movement, of the boycott movement in this country, what is it you were up against? What was the backlash you were facing?
Well, I think Sean spoke to it already. The economic interests at stake were powerful, right? So we had major corporations invested in South Africa, universities and other institutions in this country invested in those corporations. They were not willing to readily give up those investments. University of California, where I was at the time, had $4.2 billion invested in corporations in South Africa. And so when we began to take on the regents and push for disinvestment, we were taking on Reagan's appointees who were on the Board of Regents. The political symbolism was very powerful. And so initially there was quite a bit of resistance. But gradually, as that movement built and was sustained over several years, we were able to sway public opinion. As you pointed out, the sanctions were overturned by the Congress. Reagan's veto was overturned. And the tide began to change, and it became a movement that many people from across the spectrum wanted to be associated with because they could see they were on the wrong side of history.
And Eleanor, we have a couple quotes here. A lot of these were floating around this week, but just again to give you a taste of the time, 1985, George Will, who's still a very active voice in sort of conservative punditry these days, in 1985, saying that clearly some of the current campaigning against South Africa is a fad, a moral hula hoop, fun for a while. Regarding interest in a foreign crisis, even altruism is not fuel for the long haul. It is amazing when you look at the conservative movement. We think of the failure of the conservative movement in the civil rights era in this country in the 60s. Now you're advancing into the 1980s, and we can look back and say there was a huge failure there, too.
Well, it was an extraordinary time in Washington. The Republicans controlled the Senate. The Republican Party stood up to President Reagan. Nobody had overturned a presidential veto on foreign policy in the 20th century. And you had 37 of 53 Republicans, including Richard Lugar, who's still there today, Nancy Kassebaum, Mitch McConnell, who said he was in college during the civil rights movement, and he was on the side of civil rights, and then it got all complicated with affirmative action and busing and sanctions. He said made it all clear again. I mean, he stood up again against the president. And I was covering the White House then, and occasionally they would bring in small groups of reporters to chat with the president on the theory that we were going to get to know each other. I don't know that ever happened. This was already 1986. But it was cookies and coffee one afternoon. And it was during this period, and the president said that more black people drive and own cars in South Africa than there are cars in the Soviet Union. And to him, that sort of rationalized, this was, communism is the evil system, and you had to do everything to stand up to communism. And I remember it so clearly because then he reached for 2 cookies and said he'd only had half a sandwich for lunch. But Pat Buchanan was a speechwriter in the White House then. Yep. And I recall this memory to him yesterday, and he said he wrote that line, and he got it from Commentary magazine, and he said Reagan loved it, but the Secretary of State, George Shultz, was furious at him for putting it in because it made the president look like a simpleton,
right.
basically.
Anything,
yeah.
But that was part of the spirit of anything that could be linked to anti-communism, the certain segment of the right. That was the ultimate.
He believed in that, and he had the Assistant Secretary of State was Chester Crocker, who developed what he called constructive engagement, which basically rationalized the continuation of trade, especially an arms embargo, which Jimmy Carter had gone along with.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, coming up in just a minute, we are going to be joined by a former Republican member of the Senate. He was one of the Republicans who did vote for that override, vote to override that veto by Reagan of the sanctions bill in 1986. Vote was the culmination of a long cultural campaign against apartheid in the 1980s, and here is a taste of it from the Specials out of England in 1984.